A single mother accidentally discovers an abandoned hotel being sold for $1. After purchasing it despite everyone's mockery, she realizes that her life and her children's futures would never be the same. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you are watching this video. The mornings in Sarah Chen's small apartment always began the same way, with the pale wash of dawn spilling through threadbare curtains that no longer quite met in the middle, and the distant groan of pipes in the walls as the building's ancient heating system struggled to life. For as long as she could remember, since Michael had left, since the divorce papers had been signed and the custody arrangement finalized, she had risen before the alarm, pulled on the same worn robe, and moved quietly through the narrow hallway to check on her children before the chaos of the day began. Emma, her 7-year-old, slept with one arm flung across her pillow, her dark hair tangled across her face, breathing with the deep, untroubled rhythm of childhood. Across the small room they shared, 5-year-old Lucas lay curled beneath his blanket, clutching the stuffed rabbit that had been his constant companion since he was 2. Sarah stood in the doorway for a moment, watching them in the gray light, and felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the weight that had become so constant she barely noticed it anymore, except in these quiet moments when she allowed herself to feel it fully. They deserved more than this, more than a cramped 2-bedroom apartment where the refrigerator hummed too loudly and the bathroom sink dripped no matter how many times she tightened the faucet. More than a mother who worked double shifts at the diner and still came home to a stack of bills she couldn't pay, to an eviction notice taped to the door, to the slow, grinding certainty that she was failing them despite everything she did. The eviction notice had arrived 3 days ago, stark and official on cream-colored paper, giving her 30 days to vacate the premises or face legal action. She had read it once, then folded it carefully and tucked it into the kitchen drawer, where she kept all the things she couldn't bear to look at directly. The medical bills from Lucas's ear infection last winter, the past due notices from the electric company, the letter from Emma's school requesting payment for the field trip she had promised her daughter she could go on, knowing even as she promised that the money wasn't there. Sarah moved to the kitchen and began making coffee, the ritual motions grounding her even as her mind spun through calculations it had performed 100 times before. Rent, groceries, utilities, childcare. The numbers never added up. No matter how she arranged them, shuffled them, borrowed from one column to pay another, there was always a deficit, always something left unpaid, always the slow creep of debt climbing higher, like water rising in a sinking ship. She had taken the job at Murphy's Diner 18 months ago, after Michael had stopped sending the child support payments he'd promised, after her mother had made it clear that she could no longer help, not with her own fixed income barely covering her own expenses. The work was steady but exhausting, 6 days a week, sometimes 7 when Betty called in sick or when the weekend rush required extra hands. Her feet ached constantly now, a dull throb that never quite faded even when she soaked them at night. Her back had developed a permanent knot between her shoulder blades from carrying heavy trays and leaning over tables. But it was work, and work meant survival, and survival was all she could manage right now. She poured the coffee, black because milk was expensive, and sat at the small table wedged between the counter and the wall. The chair creaked under her weight, its legs uneven, and she propped a folded napkin under one corner, as she had done every morning for the past year. Through the window, she could see the parking lot below, cars beginning to stir as other residents headed to their own jobs, their own struggles. The city stretched beyond, gray towers against a grayer sky, and somewhere in that vast sprawl of concrete and glass were opportunities she could not reach, lives she could not afford to imagine. She sipped her coffee and tasted only bitterness, but she drank it anyway because caffeine was the only thing that kept her moving through the long shifts ahead. When the children woke an hour later, she had already showered and dressed, her uniform pressed as neatly as she could manage, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She made them breakfast, scrambled eggs and toast, stretching what little she had in the refrigerator into something that looked like abundance. Emma chattered about a project at school, or about a friend's birthday party she'd been invited to, and Sarah listened with a smile that felt like glass, nodding in all the right places, promising things she didn't know how she'd deliver. Lucas ate quietly, his eyes sleepy, and Sarah brushed his hair back from his forehead, kissed the top of his head, and told him they'd have a good day. They always had a good day, she told them. Even when the bills piled higher, even when the eviction notice waited in the drawer, even when the world pressed down on her shoulders until she thought she might collapse beneath the weight, she told them they would have a good day. Because what else could she tell them? That she was failing, that she was drowning, that every morning she woke up terrified that this would be the day she couldn't hold it together anymore. She dropped them at the daycare on her way to the diner, Emma skipping ahead with her backpack bouncing, Lucas holding her hand and looking up at her with the kind of trust that broke her heart. She paid the daycare woman in cash, money she had scraped together from tips, and tried not to think about next week's payment, about the month after that, about the slow accumulation of debts that had no end. The diner smelled of bacon grease and burnt coffee when she pushed through the door, the bell above it jingling cheerfully. Murphy was already behind the counter, his thick arms crossed, his expression the same mixture of gruffness and resignation it always was. He nodded at her, said nothing, and she tied her apron, grabbed her order pad, and stepped into the rhythm of the morning rush. Regulars filed in, farmers and truckers and construction workers, men whose hands bore the marks of labor, whose faces creased with lines that spoke of their own struggles. They ordered eggs and hash browns and pancakes, coffee refilled again and again, and Sarah moved among them with practiced efficiency, her smile automatic, her voice bright. She had learned long ago that cheerfulness earned better tips, that people wanted their waitress to be happy, even when happiness was the furthest thing from her mind. She carried plates and cleared tables and wiped down booths, her body moving through motions so familiar they required no thought. But her mind was elsewhere, circling the eviction notice, the bills, the impossibility of it all. Where would they go? How would she find another place to live when she could barely afford the rent she already couldn't pay? The thought of shelters, of temporary housing, of the look on Emma's face when she realized they had no home, made her stomach twist. By mid-morning, the rush had slowed, and Sarah leaned against the counter, her feet throbbing, when Betty shuffled over with a newspaper folded under her arm. Betty was older, her hair gray at the temples, her eyes sharp despite the weariness that seemed to cling to all of them who worked at Murphy's. She set the paper on the counter and tapped a small article near the bottom of the page. "You see this," she said. Sarah glanced down, squinting at the small print. It was a notice about a property auction, something about an old hotel on the edge of the county being sold by the city for unpaid taxes. The starting bid was $1. Betty snorted. $1 for that wreck. Might as well be $1 million. Thing's been falling apart for 20 years. Nobody wants it. Sarah skimmed the article, barely paying attention. The Grandview Hotel, it said, had once been a landmark, a destination for travelers passing through the valley. But decades of neglect had left it a crumbling shell. Its roof caved in, its windows shattered, its foundation questionable. The city had tried for years to offload it, but no developer would touch it, the cost of repairs far exceeding any potential profit. Now they were practically giving it away, hoping someone, anyone, would take it off their hands. Betty laughed, shaking her head. Can you imagine? Buying a hotel for $1? Like winning the lottery? Except the prize is a pile of rubble. She moved away, still chuckling, leaving Sarah staring at the article. for reasons she couldn't quite explain, so she found herself reading it again, slower this time. The auction was tomorrow afternoon at the county courthouse. $1 to start the bidding. No minimum requirements beyond that. She folded the paper carefully, her mind turning over the idea even as she told herself it was absurd. What would she do with a ruined hotel? She had no money to fix it, no skills to renovate it, no way to turn it into anything useful. It was a fantasy, the kind of desperate daydream that came to people who had run out of options. And yet the thought persisted, stubborn and insistent. $1. She had $1. She had more than $1, barely. Tucked away in a jar at home, the emergency fund she'd been trying to build, even as emergencies kept draining it. The article said the property came with the land it sat on, seen with several acres at the edge of town where the valley opened into rolling hills. Land, she thought. Land meant space. Land meant something permanent, something that couldn't be taken away by a landlord or an eviction notice. The idea was ridiculous, she told herself again, but it wouldn't leave her alone. That night, after she'd picked up the children, fed them dinner, and tucked them into bed, Sarah sat at the kitchen table with the folded newspaper in front of her. She pulled the eviction notice from the drawer and laid it beside the article, the two pieces of paper side by side. 30 days. $1. The numbers felt absurd, disconnected from reality, yet both were undeniably real. She thought of her mother's voice, sharp and critical, telling her she'd made a mess of her life, that she should have stayed with Michael, and that she was foolish to think she could manage on her own. She thought of Michael's smug expression when he'd signed the divorce papers, his casual dismissal of her concerns, his certainty that she'd fail without him. She thought of the children sleeping in the next room, unaware of how close they were to losing even this small apartment. And she thought of the hotel, crumbling and forgotten, sitting on land that no one wanted, land that could be hers for $1. It was madness. It was desperation. It was the only thing she could think of that didn't feel like admitting defeat. She pulled out her phone and searched for images of the Grandview Hotel. The photos were grim, showing a structure more ruin than building. The roof had collapsed inward, leaving gaping holes where rain and snow had poured in for years. The windows were empty frames, the glass long since shattered. The once grand facade was streaked with grime, the paint peeled away. The columns that had flanked the entrance now leaning at dangerous angles. It looked like something from a horror film, a place where ghosts might linger, where hope had died long ago. But beneath the decay, Sarah could see the bones of something that had once been beautiful. The hotel had been built in a time when architecture mattered, when buildings were crafted with care. The columns, though cracked, were ornate. The stonework, though weathered, bore intricate carvings. The scale of it, even in ruin, suggested grandeur, ambition, a belief in something lasting. She zoomed in on a photo of the land surrounding the hotel, the acres of overgrown grass and wild flowers stretching toward distant hills. It was isolated, yes, far from the noise of the city. But isolation could be peace. It could be safety. It could be a place where her children could run without fear of traffic, where they could breathe air that didn't smell of exhaust and garbage. She closed her phone and sat in the dim light of the kitchen, her hands folded on the table. The decision forming in her mind felt both reckless and inevitable, like stepping off a cliff with no assurance of landing safely. But staying here, waiting for the eviction, scraping by on tips and hope, that was falling too, only slower, more painful, with no chance of flight. She could already hear the voices, her mother's scorn, Betty's laughter, Murphy's gruff dismissal, the looks from neighbors, from strangers, from everyone who would think she'd lost her mind. A collapsed hotel for $1. What kind of fool would do that? A desperate one, she thought, a mother with nowhere else to turn, a woman who had nothing left to lose. The auction was tomorrow. She had $1. And somewhere in the wreckage of that forgotten hotel, she told herself, there had to be something worth saving, even if it was only the illusion of hope. Sarah woke the next morning with a knot of anxiety coiled tight in her stomach, the kind that made her hands tremble as she poured coffee and dressed the children for daycare. She moved through the routines with mechanical precision, her mind already miles away, at the courthouse, at the auction, at the moment when she would raise her hand and bid on something she had no right to want. Emma chattered about her day, her voice bright and oblivious, while Lucas clung to Sarah's leg as she tried to tie his shoes, his small fingers gripping her jeans. She kissed their foreheads, promised them she'd pick them up on time, and walked them to the daycare with her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. The shift at the diner crawled by with agonizing slowness. Every glance at the clock felt like watching paint dry, and Murphy kept giving her strange looks as though he could sense her distraction. She dropped a plate, shattered glass scattering across the tile, and Betty rushed over to help her clean it up, muttering under her breath about how Sarah needed to get more sleep. When her shift finally ended, Sarah untied her apron with shaking hands, grabbed her coat, and walked the 6 blocks to the courthouse. The building loomed before her, its stone facade imposing and cold, and she hesitated at the base of the steps, suddenly aware of how small she was, how out of place. Women like her didn't bid on properties, didn't walk into auctions with nothing but $1 and desperation. She thought of turning back, of returning to the diner, of pretending this moment had never happened. But the eviction notice waited at home, and her children deserved better than a mother who gave up before she even tried. She climbed the steps and pushed through the heavy doors. Inside, the courthouse smelled of old wood and floor polish, the air thick with the weight of bureaucracy. A sign pointed toward the auction room, and she followed it down a long hallway, her footsteps echoing too loudly against the marble floors. The room was smaller than she'd expected, just a handful of folding chairs arranged before a raised platform where a clerk shuffled papers. A few people were already seated, most of them older men in work jackets, farmers or contractors, she guessed, people who understood property and investment in ways she didn't. They glanced at her as she entered, their eyes assessing, dismissive, and she felt heat rise to her face. She took a seat in the back row, her hands folded tightly in her lap, and tried to steady her breathing. The clerk called the auction to order, his voice flat and bureaucratic, and began reading through a list of properties being sold. Most were parcels of land, small lots in forgotten corners of the county, things no one wanted, but which the city needed to unload. The bidding was sparse, perfunctory, men raising their hands lazily, calling out numbers that meant nothing to Sarah. Then the clerk paused, shuffled his papers, and read the next listing. The Grandview Hotel, he said, located at 1247 Valley Ridge Road. Structure severely deteriorated. Sold as is, no warranties. Starting bid, $1. A ripple of laughter ran through the room, low and cynical. Sarah's face burned. She felt the weight of their amusement pressing down on her, the casual cruelty of people who had the luxury of finding someone else's desperation funny. The clerk waited, his expression bored, and when no one raised a hand, he sighed and prepared to move to the next listing. Sarah's hand shot up before she could stop herself. $1, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The room went silent. Heads turned. The clerk blinked at her, as though unsure he'd heard correctly. $1, he repeated slowly. She nodded, her hand still raised, trembling. The clerk scanned the room. Any other bids? The men shifted in their seats. A few exchanged glances, but no one spoke. Why would they? The hotel was worthless, a liability, something no sane person would touch. The clerk banged his gavel once, the sound sharp and final. Sold to the woman in the back for $1. Congratulations, ma'am. You're now the proud owner of the Grandview Hotel. More laughter, this time louder, and Sarah felt her face go hot, her hands clenching into fists. She rose quickly, her legs unsteady, and followed the clerk to the side office where the paperwork waited. He handed her a sheaf of forms, his expression somewhere between pity and disbelief. You understand this property is uninhabitable, he said. The structure is unsafe, for you'll be responsible for any liability, any injuries, any issues that arise. She nodded, barely hearing him, and signed where he pointed. When he handed her the deed, a single piece of paper bearing her name and the address of the hotel, she stared at it as though it might vanish if she looked away. She had done it. She owned a building. Land. Something permanent. Something that couldn't be taken from her by a landlord or a late payment. Didn't matter that the building was a ruin. It didn't matter that she had no idea what to do with it. It was hers. She folded the deed carefully, tucked it into her coat pocket, and walked out of the courthouse with her head high, even as the laughter of the men in the auction room echoed in her ears. The walk back to her apartment felt surreal, as though she were moving through a dream. She picked up the children, listened to Emma's excited chatter about her day, carried Lucas on her hip when he grew too tired to walk, and all the while the deed sat in her pocket, heavy as a stone. That night, after the children were asleep, she pulled it out and spread it on the kitchen table beside the eviction notice. The contrast was absurd. One piece of paper told her she was losing her home. The other told her she now owned a collapsing hotel. She laughed, a sharp, bitter sound, and pressed her hands to her face. What had she done? The next morning, she called in sick to the diner, the first time she'd missed a shift in over a year. Murphy grumbled but didn't argue, and Sarah dressed the children warmly, packed snacks and water, and loaded them into her old car. We're going on an adventure, she told them, enforcing brightness into her voice. Emma bounced in her seat, delighted. Lucas looked skeptical but didn't complain. The drive to Valley Ridge Road took 40 minutes, the city gradually giving way to farmland, then to scrub and hills. The road narrowed, the pavement cracked and potholed, until finally she saw it. The Grandview Hotel rose before them like a monument to abandonment. It was worse in person than in the photos. The roof sagged dangerously in the center, the walls streaked with water stains and mold. The front doors hung on broken hinges, one of them leaning inward, as though the building itself were slouching in defeat. The grounds were overgrown, weeds rising waist-high, rusted metal and broken glass scattered like confetti. Sarah parked the car at a safe distance and sat staring through the windshield, her hands gripping the steering wheel. Emma pressed her face to the window. Is this it, Mama? Is this ours? Sarah swallowed hard. Yes, sweetheart. This is ours. Lucas wrinkled his nose. It looks scary. It does, Sarah admitted. But maybe it won't always be scary. Maybe we can make it better. She didn't believe the words even as she said them, but she opened the car door and stepped out, the children following. The air smelled of damp earth and decay, and the wind carried a faint whistle through the broken windows. Sarah approached the entrance slowly, her heart pounding, and pushed the door open wider. The hinges groaned, a sound like something dying, and she stepped inside. The lobby was vast, its ceiling lost in shadow where the roof had collapsed. Debris littered the floor, chunks of plaster, shattered furniture, twisted metal. Sunlight streamed through the holes above, casting strange patterns across the ruin. It was a graveyard of grandeur, a place where elegance had come to die. But even in decay, there was something haunting about it, something that whispered of what it had once been. Emma darted forward, her footsteps light, and Sarah grabbed her arm. Careful, she said sharply. Stay close to me. We don't know what's safe." They moved through the lobby slowly, Sarah's eyes scanning for dangers, for weak floors, for anything that might harm her children. Lucas clung to her hand, his eyes wide, and she pulled him close. The hotel stretched deeper than she'd imagined, hallways branching off into darkness, rooms yawning open like mouths. She could see the remnants of wallpaper, faded and peeling, patterns of roses and vines that must have been beautiful once. The floors were warped, the wood buckling in places, but solid enough in others. They reached what must have been the grand staircase, its railing shattered, its steps sagging, and Sarah stopped. She couldn't take the children upstairs, not when the structure might collapse beneath them. "This is enough for today," she said. "Let's go back to the car." Emma pouted. "But I want to explore." "Another time," Sarah said firmly. "We need to be smart about this." As they turned to leave, Sarah's foot caught on something half buried in the debris. She stumbled, caught herself, and looked down. It was a metal box, rusted and dented, its corners sharp. She crouched, brushing dirt and plaster away, and saw that it bore a small lock, broken and hanging loose. Her pulse quickened. She pried the lid open, the hinges protesting, and inside found a stack of papers, yellowed with age, but still legible. She lifted the top sheet carefully, squinting at the faded ink. It appeared to be some kind of ledger, a record of transactions. Names, dates, amounts. She flipped through the pages, her confusion deepening. There were mentions of shipments, of valuables stored, of agreements made, and at the bottom of several pages, a signature she didn't recognize, but which was repeated often enough to suggest importance. She closed the box, her hands trembling. This was something. She didn't know what, but it was something. A clue. A thread. A piece of a story the hotel had kept hidden. She tucked the box under her arm and ushered the children back to the car. As they drove away, the hotel shrinking in the rearview mirror, Sarah felt a strange mixture of dread and curiosity. She had bought a ruin for $1, expecting nothing but the land beneath it. But perhaps, just perhaps, the hotel had more to offer than she'd imagined. That night, after the children were asleep, she sat at the kitchen table with the box opened before her. She spread the papers carefully, studying them under the dim light of the kitchen lamp. The ledgers recorded transactions from decades ago, purchases and sales of items she couldn't identify, references to storage fees and safekeeping agreements. There were names she didn't recognize, addresses that no longer existed. But there was one phrase that repeated often, circled in faded ink on several pages. Vault storage, sub-level access. Sarah's breath caught. A vault. The hotel had a vault. And if these records were accurate, it had been used to store valuables for clients, and perhaps wealthy travelers passing through the valley, people who had trusted the hotel to guard their possessions. She thought of the collapsed building, the debris, the dangers lurking in every shadow. A vault would be underground, beneath the lobby, protected from the elements, even if the structure above had failed. It might still be intact. It might still hold something. The thought was absurd, the kind of fantasy she'd have dismissed a week ago. But then, a week ago, she wouldn't have bought a collapsing hotel for $1. She folded the papers and placed them back in the box, her mind already turning over possibilities. Tomorrow, she would return. She would search more carefully, methodically. She would find the vault, if it existed. Because now, for the first time since the eviction notice had arrived, since Michael had left, and since her life had spiraled into this endless struggle, she felt something other than despair. She felt hope. Fragile, foolish, desperate hope. But hope nonetheless. And in the darkness of her cramped apartment, with her children sleeping soundly in the next room, Sarah clung to that hope like a lifeline. because it was all she had left. The morning after Sarah had discovered the ledgers, she woke with a clarity of purpose she hadn't felt in months, perhaps years. The eviction notice still sat in the kitchen drawer, the bills still accumulated in their pile. But now there was something else, a thread of possibility she could follow into the unknown. She dressed quickly, her mind already at the hotel, already imagining the sublevel, the vault, whatever secrets might be waiting in the darkness beneath that ruined building. But first, there were the children to consider. She couldn't bring them back to the hotel, not while she searched for something that might not exist, not while she navigated unstable floors and collapsed ceilings. She called her mother, a conversation she'd been dreading, and asked if she could watch Emma and Lucas for the day. Her mother's voice came through the phone sharp and suspicious. "Why?" she asked. "What are you doing, that you can't take care of your own children?" Sarah swallowed her irritation. "I have something I need to take care of. Please, Mom, just for today." There was a long pause, heavy with judgment. "Fine," her mother said at last. "But Sarah, you need to get your priorities straight. Those kids need stability, not whatever wild scheme you're cooking up now." Sarah thanked her and ended the call before the criticism could continue. She dropped the children at her mother's apartment an hour later, enduring the pointed looks and the barely concealed disapproval. Her mother stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching Sarah with eyes that seemed to catalog every failure, every mistake. "You look exhausted," her mother said. "You're working yourself to death for nothing. Maybe if you'd tried harder with Michael, if you hadn't been so stubborn, you wouldn't be in this mess." Sarah bit back the response that rose in her throat, the anger that flared hot and immediate. Instead, she kissed Emma and Lucas, promised she'd be back before dinner, and left before her mother could say anything more. The drive to the hotel felt longer this time, each mile weighted with doubt. What was she doing? Chasing ghosts, like following the desperate fantasy of a woman who had run out of real options. The rational part of her mind whispered that she was wasting time, that she should be job hunting, apartment hunting, doing something practical instead of searching for a vault that probably didn't exist in a building that should be condemned. But the ledgers had been real. The records had been detailed, specific. Vault storage, sub-level access. Those weren't the words of fantasy. They were documentation, evidence of something that had once existed. Whether it still did, whether it held anything of value, those were questions she couldn't answer without looking. The hotel rose before her again, its silhouette dark against the pale morning sky. Sarah parked and sat for a moment, staring at the structure, trying to see it not as a ruin, but as a puzzle, like a place where answers might be hidden. She had brought a flashlight, a crowbar, work gloves, and a length of rope, things she'd scrounged from the apartment and the diner's storage closet. They felt inadequate, the tools of an amateur, but they were all she had. She stepped out of the car and approached the hotel, the morning air cool and damp, carrying the smell of wet earth and decay. The front doors stood as she'd left them, one hanging crookedly, and she pushed through into the lobby. The space felt different in the morning light, less ominous, but no less ruined. She stood in the center of the room, the flashlight heavy in her hand, and tried to think like someone designing a hotel in another era. Where would a vault be placed? Underground, certainly for security. Accessible from the lobby for convenience. But hidden, discreet. Not something guests would stumble upon accidentally. She began searching the walls, running her hands along the peeling wallpaper, tapping surfaces, listening for hollow spaces. The work was slow, methodical, and dust clung to her clothes and hair as she moved. She found nothing in the main lobby, just solid walls and rotting plaster, and moved to the hallways that branched off the sides. One led to what must have been a dining room, its tables long gone, the floor littered with broken dishes and the frames of chairs. Another opened into a kitchen, the equipment rusted beyond recognition, the smell of mold overwhelming. Sarah pulled her shirt over her nose and pressed on, checking walls, floors, anything that might conceal an entrance. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, sending shafts of light through the broken roof, painting the ruin in gold and shadow. Sarah's hands ached from gripping the crowbar, her knees sore from kneeling on debris-strewn floors. Doubt crept in, insidious and cold. She was wasting her time. There was no vault. The ledgers had been old records of something that no longer existed, torn down or sealed off decades ago. She should leave, return to her mother's apartment, pick up her children, and face the reality of her situation. But she didn't. She kept searching, driven by something she couldn't name, something stubborn and irrational that refused to quit. It was late afternoon when she found it. She had returned to the lobby, exhausted and filthy, and was about to give up when she noticed something she'd missed before. In the far corner, where the light barely reached, there was a section of floor that looked different. The wood was darker, worn in a pattern that suggested heavy use, as though something had been moved across it repeatedly. She knelt, brushing away debris, and saw the faint outline of a seam. Her heart quickened. She worked the crowbar into the gap, prying gently, and felt the board shift. It wasn't nailed down like the others. It was designed to lift. She pulled harder, and the section of floor came up, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. Sarah sat back on her heels, her breath coming fast, her hands trembling. She had found it. The sublevel. She clicked on the flashlight and shone it down the stairs. The steps were stone, worn smooth by time, and they disappeared into blackness that seemed to swallow the light. The air rising from below was cold and damp, carrying a smell of earth and something metallic, like old coins. She stood slowly, her legs unsteady, and stared into that darkness. Every instinct told her to be cautious, to wait, to bring someone with her. But who? Who would believe her? Who would come to this ruin and descend into a hole in the ground on the word of a desperate single mother who'd bought a collapsing hotel for $1? She was alone in this. She had always been alone. Sarah took a deep breath, gripped the flashlight tightly, and began to descend. The stairs were steep, narrow, the walls pressing close on either side. She counted the steps as she went. 10, 15, 20. The light bouncing ahead of her, revealing only fragments of what lay below. The air grew colder with each step, the damp seeping through her clothes, and she shivered despite herself. At last, the stairs ended, opening into a small chamber, and Sarah swept the flashlight across the space, her breath catching. The walls were lined with metal shelving, rusted but intact, and on those shelves sat rows of boxes, crates, containers of various sizes. Most were damaged, their contents spilled or rotted away, but some remained sealed, their surfaces dusty, but whole. She moved forward slowly, her footsteps echoing, and approached the nearest shelf. She lifted a box carefully, its weight surprising, and set it on the ground. The lid was stuck, but she worked it free with the crowbar, the metal groaning, and inside found stacks of papers, contracts, deeds, documents yellowed with age. She set them aside and moved to another container, a metal trunk with a broken lock. Inside were clothing, moth-eaten and fragile, and beneath them, a leather satchel. She opened the satchel and pulled out bundles of currency, old bills with denominations and designs she didn't recognize. They crumbled slightly at her touch, brittle with age, but they were unmistakably money. Her pulse hammered. This was real. The vault had been used, just as the ledgers had said. people had stored their valuables here, and some of those valuables remained. She moved through the chamber systematically, opening containers, cataloging what she found. More documents, jewelry tangled and tarnished, books swollen with moisture, coins scattered loose across shelves. Some of it was worthless, destroyed by time and neglect. But some of it, the coins, the jewelry, the currency, might still hold value. She had no way of knowing how much, no expertise to assess it, but the sheer quantity suggested wealth. At the far end of the chamber, set into the wall, was a heavy door. Sarah approached it slowly, the flashlight trembling in her hand. The door was metal, reinforced, with a combination lock that had rusted, but still held. She tried the handle, but it didn't budge. Whatever lay beyond was sealed, locked away by someone who had taken care to protect it. She stared at the door, her mind racing. This was it. This was the real vault. Everything she'd found so far had been storage, items left by clients of the hotel. But this door, this lock, suggested something more. Something the hotel itself had kept. Sarah tried to pry it open with the crowbar, but the door was too solid, the lock too stubborn. She would need tools she didn't have, expertise she didn't possess. The frustration was sharp, immediate, but beneath it was a deeper feeling, a sense of certainty. She had been right. The vault existed. It held something valuable. And if she could open that door, if she could access what lay beyond, it might be enough. Enough to pay the bills, to keep her children housed and fed, to change everything. She backed away from the door, her flashlight sweeping the chamber one last time, and began to climb the stairs. Her legs ached, her body exhausted, but her mind was alight with possibility. She emerged into the lobby, the late afternoon sun slanting through the broken roof, and closed the hatch carefully, covering it again with debris so it wouldn't be obvious to anyone who might wander through. The drive back to the city felt surreal, as though she'd crossed into another world and was only now returning. She picked up the children from her mother's apartment, enduring more questions, more judgment, and drove home in silence, her thoughts churning. That night, after Emma and Lucas were asleep, Sarah sat at the kitchen table with the documents she'd brought from the vault. She spread them carefully, studying the old contracts, the faded signatures, trying to piece together a story. The hotel had operated as more than just lodging. It had been a kind of bank, a place where wealthy travelers stored valuables while they conducted business in the valley. The records went back nearly a century, to a time when the hotel had been a hub of commerce, a destination for people moving through the region. But something had happened. The records ended abruptly in the 1960s, as though the hotel had suddenly closed its vault services. She found a newspaper clipping tucked among the papers, yellowed and fragile, and unfolded it carefully. The headline read, "Grandview Hotel Closes Amid Financial Scandal." She skimmed the article, her eyes catching on phrases. Mismanagement of funds, owners fled, creditors left unpaid. The hotel had collapsed, not from neglect, but from corruption. The people who'd run it had disappeared, and with them, the knowledge of what remained in the vault. Sarah leaned back in her chair, the pieces falling into place. The vault had been forgotten because the people who knew about it were gone. The clients who'd stored their valuables had either reclaimed them before the scandal or had lost track of them in the chaos. What remained was the residue, the things left behind, abandoned, sealed away for decades. And now it was hers. The thought was dizzying. She owned this. The building, the land, the vault, everything in it. But owning it and accessing it were two different things. She needed help. She needed someone who could open that metal door, who understood locks and safes and the mechanics of old vaults. She needed money to hire that help, money she didn't have. The frustration was overwhelming, the sense that she'd come so close only to be stopped by something as mundane as a locked door. But she couldn't give up, not now. She had seen the vault. She had held the evidence of what it contained. She would find a way. The next day, Sarah went to work at the diner, her mind still on the vault. She moved through her shift mechanically, pouring coffee, taking orders, clearing tables. But her thoughts were elsewhere. She thought of the locked door, the metal shelves, the coins and currency she'd found. She thought of what might lie beyond that door and sealed away, waiting. It was mid-morning when Betty approached her, concern etched in her weathered face. "You okay, honey?" she asked. "You look like you haven't slept in a week." Sarah forced a smile. "I'm fine. Just a lot on my mind." Betty studied her for a moment, then leaned closer, her voice dropping. "You didn't actually buy that hotel, did you? Word gets around. People are talking." Sarah felt her face flush. "I did." Betty's eyes widened. "Sarah, that place is a death trap. What were you thinking?" "I was thinking I needed somewhere to go when my landlord kicks me out," Sarah said, her voice sharper than she intended. "I was thinking $1 was all I could afford." Betty's expression softened. "Oh, honey, you should have said something. We could have helped." "Could you?" Sarah asked. "Could you pay my rent? Could you give me a place to live? Could you fix the fact that I'm drowning and no one seems to notice?" Betty stepped back, her face stricken, and Sarah immediately regretted her words. "I'm sorry," Sarah said quickly. "I didn't mean that. I'm just stressed." Betty nodded slowly, but the warmth in her eyes had dimmed. "I understand. But Sarah, chasing dreams doesn't put food on the table. You need to be practical." Practical, Sarah thought bitterly. Everyone wanted her to be practical. Her mother, Betty, even the voice in her own head. But practical hadn't saved her. Practical had left her with an eviction notice and a life she couldn't afford. Maybe it was time to stop being practical. That evening, Sarah returned to the hotel. She couldn't stay away. The vault called to her, the locked door an obsession she couldn't shake. She descended the stairs again, her flashlight cutting through the darkness, and stood before the metal door. She tried the lock again, uselessly, her fingers tracing the rusted mechanism. She needed a locksmith, but how could she afford one? She sat on the cold stone floor, her back against the wall, and stared at the door. The frustration was crushing, the sense that she was so close, yet impossibly far. She thought of her children, of Emma's bright chatter and Lucas's quiet trust. She thought of the eviction notice, of the life that was slipping through her fingers. She couldn't fail them. She wouldn't. As she sat there, her eyes drifted across the chamber, and she noticed something she'd missed before. In the corner, half hidden behind a fallen shelf, was another container. It was smaller than the others, a wooden box with metal clasps. She crawled over to it, unpushed the shelf aside, and lifted the box carefully. It was heavy, solid, and when she opened it, her breath caught. Inside were coins, dozens of them, gleaming faintly in the flashlight's beam. But these weren't like the others she'd found. These were gold. She lifted one, felt its weight, saw the markings etched into its surface. She didn't know coins, didn't know their value, but gold was gold. Even she knew that. She counted them quickly, her hands shaking. 43 coins, each one heavy, substantial. If they were real, if they were worth anything close to what she thought, this could be the answer. This could pay for a locksmith, for tools, for whatever she needed to open that metal door. Sarah closed the box carefully, clutched it to her chest, and climbed the stairs. Her heart pounded with something that felt dangerously like hope. She drove straight to a pawn shop on the edge of town, a place she'd passed 100 times but never entered. The man behind the counter looked up as she walked in, his eyes narrowing as he took in her appearance, the dirt on her clothes, the desperation in her face. She set the box on the counter and opened it. "I need to know what these are worth," she said. The man picked up a coin, examined it under a light, tested its weight, and his expression shifted from skepticism to interest. "Where did you get these?" he asked. "They're mine," Sarah said firmly. "I found them." He studied her for a moment, then set the coin down. "These are gold, early 20th century. They're worth a lot more than face value. I can give you $12,000 for the lot." Sarah's knees went weak. $12,000. It was more money than she'd seen in years. It was rent, food, security. It was breathing room. She thought of the vault, of the locked door, of what might lie beyond. If these coins were worth $12,000, what else might be waiting? She shook her head. "I need to think about it," she said, closing the box. The man shrugged. "Suit yourself. But the offer stands." Sarah left the shop, the box heavy in her arms, and sat in her car for a long time. 12,000. She could take it, solve her immediate problems, give herself time. But the vault remained. The locked door waited. And somewhere beyond it, she was certain, lay something more. She drove home, the box on the seat beside her. And that night, she made her decision. She would sell the coins, but not all of them. She would keep enough to hire a locksmith and to buy the tools she needed to open that door. The rest she would use to keep her children safe, to buy time while she figured out what to do next. It wasn't practical. It was a gamble. But everything in her life had become a gamble, and for once, she wanted to bet on something that felt like hers. The following week, Sarah sold 30 of the coins, keeping 13 back. The money from the sale was deposited into her bank account, a number so large it felt unreal. She paid the overdue rent, bought groceries that filled the refrigerator, and for the first time in months, she didn't wake up in the middle of the night in a panic about money. But the relief was temporary. She knew that. The real answer lay in the vault, behind that locked door. She found a locksmith through an online search, a man with good reviews who specialized in old safes. She called him, described the door as vaguely as she could, and asked if he could help. He quoted her a price that made her wince, but she had the money now. She hired him. When he arrived at the hotel the following week, he took one look at the building and shook his head. "You sure about this place?" he asked. "It looks like it could come down any second." Sarah nodded. "I'm sure." He followed her inside, his expression dubious, and descended the stairs into the sublevel. He examined the metal door, the rusted lock, and whistled low. "This is old, really old, but I can open it. It'll take time." Sarah nodded. "Do it." He worked for hours, his tools spread across the stone floor, his hands steady and practiced. Sarah sat on the stairs, watching, her nerves fraying with each passing minute. What if the door opened to reveal nothing? What if the vault beyond was empty, or flooded, or destroyed? What if she'd spent the last of her resources on a fantasy? At last, the locksmith sat back, his face flushed with effort. "Got it," he said. He turned the handle, and the door swung open with a groan, revealing darkness beyond. Sarah stood quickly, her flashlight shaking in her hand, and stepped forward. The locksmith moved aside, and she shone the light into the space beyond the door. Her breath caught. It was a room, larger than the chamber outside, its walls lined with metal cabinets and shelves. And on those shelves, gleaming faintly in the flashlight's beam, were rows of metal boxes, stacks of containers, piles of items she couldn't yet identify. The locksmith whistled again. "Looks like you hit the jackpot," he said. Sarah could only stare, her heart pounding, her mind struggling to comprehend what she was seeing. The vault was full. Whatever had been stored here, whatever the hotel's owners had left behind, it remained. Untouched. Waiting. She took a step forward, then another, the light sweeping across surfaces that glinted with promise. She had done it. Against every voice that told her she was foolish, every obstacle that had been thrown in her path, she had found it. The locksmith cleared his throat behind her. "You want me to stick around, or are you good?" Sarah turned, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I'm good. Thank you." He nodded, gathered his tools, and left. Sarah heard his footsteps fade up the stairs, the distant sound of the door closing above. And then there was only silence, and the beam of her flashlight, and the vault stretching before her, full of secrets she had yet to uncover. She stepped fully into the room, her breath shallow, and began to explore. The metal boxes were labeled, faded handwriting on tags that crumbled at her touch. She opened one carefully, her hands trembling, and inside found jewelry, diamonds, and emeralds set in gold, tarnished but unmistakable. She opened another and found stacks of bonds, old certificates bearing the names of corporations and banks, some of which she recognized, some she didn't. A third box held more currency, bundles of bills and denominations she'd never seen, wrapped in paper that disintegrated as she touched it. She moved through the room methodically, opening containers, cataloging what she found. Coins, jewelry, bonds, stock certificates, art rolled in protective cloth, sculptures wrapped in burlap, documents in languages she couldn't read. The sheer volume was staggering, the wealth represented here beyond anything she could have imagined. She didn't know what it was all worth. She didn't know if any of it was still valid, if the bonds could be cashed, if the stocks held value, if the jewelry could be sold. But it was real. It was here. And it was hers. Sarah sat down on the cold stone floor, surrounded by the remnants of wealth someone had hidden away and forgotten, and felt something break inside her. Not despair, not fear, but release. The weight that had pressed on her for so long, the crushing certainty that she would fail, that she couldn't provide for her children, that the world would grind her down until there was nothing left. It lifted. She had taken a chance. She had bet everything on a single dollar and a collapsing hotel. And she had won. She didn't know yet what came next. There would be appraisals, experts, legal questions about ownership and taxes. There would be people who would try to take it from her, who would claim she didn't deserve it, who would say it wasn't really hers. But for now, in the silence of the vault, with the beam of her flashlight painting gold across the darkness, Sarah allowed herself to feel something she hadn't felt in years. She felt safe. She felt free. And she felt, for the first time since Michael had left, since the bills had started piling up, since the eviction notice had arrived, like she could breathe. Sarah spent that first night after opening the vault sitting on the stone floor, unable to leave. She had called her mother and told her she'd be late picking up the children, enduring the sharp reproach in her mother's voice, the accusation that she was neglecting her responsibilities. But Sarah couldn't tear herself away. She moved through the vault room methodically, her flashlight beam painting across surfaces that held decades of accumulated wealth, and with trembling hands, she photographed everything. Each box, each stack, each gleaming piece of jewelry or yellowed certificate. The camera on her phone filled with images that seemed impossible, as though she were documenting a dream that would vanish when she woke. But the metal was solid under her fingers, the coins heavy in her palm, the bonds crisp despite their age. This was real. When she finally climbed the stairs and emerged into the lobby, the moon was high, casting silver light through the broken roof. She covered the hatch carefully, piling debris over it until it was invisible again, and walked to her car on legs that felt disconnected from her body. The drive back to the city passed in a blur, and when she picked up Emma and Lucas from her mother's apartment, she barely heard the lecture about punctuality and responsibility. She gathered her children, thanked her mother with mechanical politeness, and drove home through streets that felt alien, as though she'd returned from another world. That night, after the children were asleep, Sarah sat at the kitchen table with her phone, scrolling through the photographs. Each image was a question she didn't know how to answer. What were these things worth? How did she find out? Who could she trust with this information? The weight of it pressed on her, not the crushing weight of before, but something different, something vast and terrifying in its potential. She had stumbled into something enormous, and she had no idea how to navigate it. The next morning, Sarah called in sick to the diner again. Murphy's voice was tight with irritation. "This is the second time in 2 weeks, Sarah. I can't keep holding your shifts if you're not reliable." "I understand," Sarah said quietly. "I'm sorry." She hung up before he could say more and sat staring at the phone. Her job at the diner, which had been everything, her lifeline, her survival, suddenly felt impossibly small. But she couldn't quit. Not yet. Not until she knew for certain what she had found. She spent the day researching, typing phrases into search engines, trying to understand the world she'd stumbled into. The estate appraisers, antique valuations, authentication services, legal ownership of found property. The information was overwhelming, contradictory, filled with warnings about scams and fraudulent buyers. She didn't know who to trust. Finally, she found a name that appeared repeatedly in articles about estate discoveries and historical valuations. Marcus Hendricks, a certified appraiser based in the city, with credentials from institutions she recognized. His website was professional, his reviews positive, and after an hour of deliberation, Sarah called his office. The receptionist who answered was polite but brisk, and when Sarah tried to explain what she'd found, her words stumbling over themselves, the woman's tone shifted to barely concealed skepticism. "We handle estate appraisals," the woman said carefully. "If you have items you'd like assessed, you can bring them to our office. Mr. Hendricks charges a consultation fee of $500. Sarah's stomach dropped. $500. It was money she had now, from the coins, but spending it on what might turn out to be nothing felt reckless. Yet what choice did she have? "I'd like to make an appointment," Sarah said. The receptionist scheduled her for the following week, and Sarah spent the intervening days in a state of suspended anxiety. She returned to the vault twice more, each time bringing a few items back with her. A handful of jewelry pieces, several bonds, a stack of old currency, a few coins. She didn't dare bring everything, terrified of losing it, of being robbed, of the whole discovery collapsing before she understood what it meant. She wrapped the items carefully in cloth and tucked them into a backpack that she kept close at all times. At work, Betty noticed her distraction, the way Sarah's eyes seemed focused on something far away. "You're acting strange," Betty said one afternoon, cornering her by the coffee station. "What's going on?" "Nothing," Sarah said quickly, "just stressed about the apartment situation." Betty frowned. "You still haven't figured out where you're going when the eviction happens." Sarah hesitated. She wanted to tell someone, to share the impossible thing that had happened, but the words wouldn't come. How could she explain? She'd bought a collapsing hotel for $1 and found a fortune in its basement. It sounded insane even in her own mind. "I'm working on it," Sarah said at last, and Betty shook her head unconvinced. The day of the appointment with Marcus Hendricks arrived with a weight that made it hard for Sarah to breathe. She dropped the children at daycare, the backpack slung over her shoulder, and drove to the address listed on the website. The building was in a nice part of the city, glass and steel, the kind of place where people wore suits and carried briefcases. Sarah felt painfully out of place in her worn jeans and faded jacket, her backpack old and frayed. The receptionist, the same woman Sarah had spoken to on the phone, looked up as she entered, her expression polite but distant. "Sarah Chen," Sarah said. "I have an appointment with Mr. Hendricks." The woman nodded, gestured to a chair, and Sarah sat, clutching the backpack in her lap. The office was elegant, walls lined with framed certificates and photographs of valuable items Hendricks had appraised. Sarah studied them, trying to calm her nerves, and wondered if what she carried would even register in a place like this. After 20 minutes, a door opened, and a man stepped out. He was in his 50s, graying at the temples, dressed in a crisp shirt and tie. "Marcus Hendricks," he said, extending a hand. "Ms. Chen." Sarah stood quickly, shook his hand, and followed him into a private office. The room was spacious, dominated by a large desk and a work table covered with magnifying equipment and scales. Hendricks gestured for her to sit and took his own seat across from her. "Now," he said, folding his hands on the desk. "The receptionist mentioned you have some items for appraisal. What exactly are we looking at?" Sarah opened the backpack, her hands trembling slightly, and began pulling out the wrapped items. She set them on the desk one by one, and Hendricks watched with an expression that was carefully neutral. When she finished, she stepped back and waited. Hendricks reached for the first bundle, unwrapped it, and paused. His eyes, which had been polite but detached, sharpened. He lifted a necklace, held it to the light, examined the stones set in the gold. "Where did you get this?" he asked quietly. Sarah swallowed. "I found it. In a property I own." Hendricks set the necklace down and reached for another piece, a bracelet heavy with diamonds. He studied it for a long moment, then looked up at her. "Ms. Chen, these are not costume jewelry. These are genuine, high quality, early 20th century, if I'm not mistaken." Sarah's heart pounded. "Are they valuable?" Hendricks picked up a magnifying glass, examined one of the diamonds more closely, and nodded slowly. "Very." He moved to the bonds next, unfolding them carefully, reading the fine print. "Some of these corporations still exist," he said. "If these bonds are legitimate, if they haven't been redeemed, they could be worth significant sums." He paused, looked at her sharply. "How much more do you have?" Sarah hesitated. "A lot more." Hendricks leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Ms. Chen, I need you to understand something. If what you're telling me is true, if you found a cache of items like these, we're talking about a major discovery. This isn't something you handle casually. You'll need legal counsel, authentication experts, possibly even law enforcement to verify that everything is above board." Sarah felt a chill. Law enforcement. Hendricks nodded. "Not because you've done anything wrong, but because discoveries of this magnitude attract attention. You need to protect yourself. Make sure everything is documented, legal, indisputable." He paused. "I'd like to see the rest. All of it. If you're comfortable bringing it here, or if you'd prefer, I can come to the location. But I need to assess the full scope before I can give you accurate valuations." Sarah's mind raced. Could she trust him? She had no way of knowing. But she also had no other options. Hendricks seemed professional, knowledgeable, and his concern about legal documentation suggested he was thinking about her protection, not just his own interests. She made her decision. "I can bring more," she said, "but I'd prefer you come to the location. It's not easily accessible." And Hendricks studied her for a moment, then nodded. "I can do that." "When?" "Tomorrow," Sarah said. Hendricks agreed, and they arranged the details. Sarah left the office in a daze, the backpack lighter now. Several of the items left with Hendricks for preliminary testing. She felt exposed, vulnerable, as though by bringing this into the light she'd set something in motion she couldn't stop. But there was no going back now. The next morning, Sarah met Hendricks at the hotel. He arrived in a sleek car, his expression shifting from professional curiosity to shock as he took in the ruined building. "This is the property?" he asked. Sarah nodded. "It's structurally unsound. We'll need to be careful." Hendricks followed her inside, his steps cautious, and when she led him to the hatch in the floor, his shock deepened. "You found this by accident?" he asked. Sarah smiled faintly. "I was looking for it. Sort of." She descended the stairs first, and Hendricks followed, his flashlight joining hers. When they reached the outer chamber, he stopped, staring at the shelves, the boxes, the scattered remnants of wealth. "And there's more," Sarah said, leading him to the metal door. She pushed it open, and Hendricks stepped into the vault room. For a long moment, he said nothing. He simply stood in the doorway, his flashlight sweeping across the metal cabinets, the rows of containers, the piles of items gleaming faintly in the light. Then he turned to her, his face pale. "Ms. Chen, do you understand what you found here?" Sarah shook her head. "Not really." Hendricks moved into the room, approaching the nearest cabinet, and opened it carefully. He pulled out a stack of bonds, examined them, and then moved to another cabinet. More bonds, stock certificates, currency. He opened a box and found jewelry, lifted a necklace that caught the light, diamonds flashing. "This is extraordinary," he said quietly. "This is a museum-quality collection. If even half of this is authentic, if the bonds and stocks are still valid, you're looking at tens of millions of dollars. Possibly more." Sarah felt her knees weaken. Tens of millions. Hendricks nodded, his expression serious. "But we need to authenticate everything. That will take time. Weeks, possibly months. I'll need to bring in specialists, historians, financial experts. This isn't something I can assess alone." Sarah leaned against the wall, her mind struggling to process the numbers. Tens of millions. How could that be real? How could she, a single mother working at a diner, have stumbled into something like this? Hendricks spent hours in the vault, photographing, cataloging, making notes. He asked Sarah questions about how she'd found it, about the hotel's history, about the ledgers she'd discovered. When he finally climbed the stairs and emerged into the lobby, the sun was setting, painting the ruin in red and gold. "We'll need to secure this location," he said. "Hire security. Maybe even move the items to a safe facility." Sarah nodded numbly. Hendricks looked at her, his expression softening. "Ms. Chen, I know this is overwhelming, but you've done something remarkable here. You've uncovered a piece of history. And if we do this right, it will change your life. Change your life." The words echoed in Sarah's mind as she drove home that night. She picked up the children, fed them dinner, tucked them into bed, and sat at the kitchen table staring at nothing. Hendricks had promised to call within a few days with a preliminary assessment. Until then, she was left to wait, suspended between the life she'd known and the one that might be waiting. The days that followed were agonizing. Sarah returned to work at the diner, the routines feeling surreal, as though she were playing a part in a play. She carried plates, poured coffee, smiled at customers, all while her mind churned with images of the vault, the bonds, the jewelry. Betty noticed her distraction again. "You're going to drop another plate if you don't focus," she said sharply. Sarah apologized and tried to concentrate, but it was impossible. 3 days after Hendricks had visited the vault, he called. "Miss Chen," he said, his voice tight with something Sarah couldn't identify. I need you to come to my office. Today, if possible." Sarah's heart lurched. "Is something wrong?" Hendricks paused. "No. But we need to talk. In person." Sarah left work early, ignoring Murphy's protests, and drove to Hendricks's office. The receptionist showed her in immediately, and Hendricks stood as she entered, his expression grave. "Sit down," he said. Sarah sat, her hands gripping the arms of the chair. Hendricks pulled a folder from his desk and opened it. "Ms. Chen, I've had 3 specialists examine the items you found: an antiquities expert, a financial historian, and a gemologist. They've authenticated a portion of the collection, and the results are extraordinary." He paused, as though choosing his words carefully. The jewelry alone is worth approximately $42 million. The bonds and stock certificates, on many of which are still valid, total another $78 million. The currency, the coins, the art, all combined, we're estimating the total value of what you've found at $319 million. Sarah stared at him. The number hung in the air, incomprehensible, absurd. She tried to speak, but no words came. Hendricks leaned forward. "Ms. Chen, are you all right?" Sarah shook her head slowly. "That can't be right." Hendricks pulled out documents, spread them across the desk. Appraisal reports, authentication certificates, financial statements. "I assure you, it is. This is one of the most significant finds of this kind in decades. You've discovered a vault that was sealed and forgotten, and the wealth it contained has appreciated dramatically over time. Some of these bonds are from corporations that became giants. Some of the jewelry contains stones that are now exceedingly rare. You found a fortune, $319 million. Sarah's vision blurred. She felt dizzy, disconnected from her body. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening to her. Hendricks handed her a glass of water, and she drank it without tasting. "There are steps we need to take," he continued gently. "Legal documentation, tax considerations, secure storage. But Ms. Chen, once this is processed, once everything is official, that money is yours. You own the property. You found the vault. Under salvage and discovery laws, it belongs to you." Sarah set the glass down, her hands trembling. "What do I do?" Hendricks smiled. "You hire a lawyer. You hire a financial advisor. And you prepare for your life to change." The weeks that followed were a blur. Hendricks connected Sarah with a law firm that specialized in estate and property law, and they took over the complex process of legitimizing her claim. There were interviews, depositions, meetings with tax authorities. The media got wind of the story, and suddenly Sarah's name was in the newspapers, her face on local news broadcasts. Single mother discovers $319 million fortune in abandoned hotel. The headlines were sensational, the stories breathless, and Sarah found herself thrust into a world she didn't understand. Reporters called her constantly. People she hadn't spoken to in years reached out, suddenly interested in her life. Her mother called, her voice strange, almost frightened, asking if the news was true. Even Michael called, his tone carefully neutral, asking if they could talk, if maybe they could work things out. But Sarah hung up on him. She hired security for the hotel, professionals who guarded the entrance and the vault while the authentication process continued. She hired a financial advisor, a woman named Patricia, who spoke in calm, measured tones about trusts and investments and long-term planning. And slowly, painfully, Sarah began to accept that this was real. The eviction notice, which had terrified her for so long, became irrelevant. She paid the landlord in full, then gave notice that she'd be moving out. Not because she had to, but because she chose to. She found a house, a real house with a yard where Emma and Lucas could play, with bedrooms for each of them, with space and light and safety. The day she signed the lease, she sat in the empty living room and cried, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of knowing her children would never have to worry about losing their home again. The money began to transfer into accounts Patricia had set up, carefully structured to protect Sarah from taxes and bad investments. $319 million. Even written down, even deposited into accounts bearing her name, it felt like fiction. Sarah met with Patricia weekly, learning about portfolios and charitable trusts, about how to manage wealth responsibly. "I want to set up college funds for my children," Sarah said, "and I want to pay off my mother's debts." Patricia nodded, taking notes. "We can do that." "What else?" Sarah thought for a moment. "I want to donate to the diner where I worked. Murphy kept me employed when no one else would. And I want to help other single mothers, women in situations like mine, women who are drowning and don't see a way out." Patricia smiled. "We can absolutely do that. Let's talk about starting a foundation." The transformation of Sarah's life was not instantaneous. Money solved many problems, but it couldn't erase the years of struggle, the scars left by poverty and fear. She still woke sometimes in the middle of the night, heart pounding, convinced it had all been a dream. She still checked her bank balance obsessively, unable to believe the numbers were real. But slowly, she adjusted. She quit the diner, though it felt strange to walk away from the place that had sustained her for so long. Murphy grumbled about losing a good waitress, but when Sarah handed him a check for $50,000, telling him it was for the business, for repairs and upgrades he'd been putting off, the old man's eyes filled with tears. Betty hugged her, laughing and crying at the same time. "You did it," she said. "I don't know how, but you did it." The hardest conversation was with her mother. Sarah drove to her mother's apartment one afternoon, knocked on the door, and waited. When her mother opened it, her expression was wary, defensive. "Sarah," she said, "I saw the news. Is it true?" Sarah nodded. "It's true." Her mother stepped aside, and Sarah entered the small apartment that smelled of old coffee and loneliness. They sat at the kitchen table, and for a long moment, neither spoke. Then Sarah pulled out an envelope and set it on the table. "I paid off your debts," she said quietly. "The credit cards, the medical bills, all of it. You don't owe anyone anything." Her mother stared at the envelope, her face unreadable. "Why?" "Because you're my mother," Sarah said. "And because I can." Her mother's eyes filled with tears, and for the first time in years, Sarah saw vulnerability there, the cracks in the armor her mother had worn for so long. "I was wrong about you," her mother said, her voice breaking. "I thought you were making a mistake, leaving Michael, trying to do it on your own. I thought you'd fail." Sarah nodded. "I know." Her mother reached across the table, took Sarah's hand, and squeezed it. "I'm sorry. I should have believed in you." Sarah squeezed back, and though the years of hurt didn't vanish, something shifted. The hardness softened, just a little. The word spread quickly through the community. Sarah Chen, the single mother who'd been working at Murphy's diner, had bought a hotel for $1 and found a fortune. The reactions were varied. Some people were genuinely happy for her, celebrating her luck, her perseverance. Others were skeptical, convinced there must be some trick, some angle she wasn't revealing. And a few were bitter, resentful, whispering that she didn't deserve it, that it should have gone to someone more deserving. Sarah heard the whispers, saw the looks, but she didn't let them touch her. She had spent too long caring what others thought, trying to meet their expectations, apologizing for her existence. She was done with that. One afternoon, Sarah returned to the hotel. The security guards nodded to her as she passed, and she walked through the ruined lobby, her footsteps echoing. The building was still a wreck, still dangerous, and she had no plans to renovate it. But she wanted to see it one more time, to stand in the place where her life had changed. She descended the stairs into the vault, now empty, the items removed and stored in secure facilities. The metal shelves stood bare, the cabinets open, the room stripped of its secrets. but the space still held a kind of power, a reminder of what had been hidden here, of what she had dared to seek. Sarah stood in the center of the room, the silence pressing around her, and thought of the journey that had brought her here, the desperation, the fear, the impossible gamble of spending a single dollar on a dream. She thought of Emma and Lucas, safe now, their futures secure. She thought of the foundation she was building, the women she would help, the lives that might be changed because she had refused to give up. "This is where it started," she whispered to the empty vault. "This is where I found myself." When she climbed the stairs and emerged into the lobby, the sun was setting, light streaming through the broken roof in golden shafts. Sarah stood in the doorway, looking back at the ruin, and felt a sense of peace she hadn't known was possible. The hotel had given her a gift, not just wealth, but the chance to rebuild her life on her own terms, to prove to herself and to everyone who had doubted her that she was stronger than they knew. She turned and walked to her car, the gravel crunching under her feet, and drove away. The hotel grew smaller in the rearview mirror, a collapsing monument to what had been, until finally it disappeared behind the hills. Sarah didn't look back. 6 months after the discovery, Sarah stood in the living room of her new house, watching Emma and Lucas play in the yard through the wide windows. The house was beautiful, filled with light and laughter, the kind of home she'd once only dreamed about. Patricia had helped her invest the majority of the money wisely, setting up trusts for the children, funds for charity, accounts that would generate income for the rest of her life. She would never have to worry about rent, about bills, about whether she could afford groceries. She was free. But freedom, Sarah had learned, came with its own weight. She had spent so long defined by her struggle that when the struggle ended, she wasn't sure who she was. The money had solved her problems, but it hadn't filled the empty spaces inside her. She was working on that now, seeing a therapist, learning to process the years of trauma and fear, learning to believe that she deserved this life. It was slow work, painful at times, but necessary. Emma ran up to the window, her face flushed with joy, and waved. Sarah waved back, smiling. Lucas followed, his stuffed rabbit tucked under his arm, and Sarah felt her chest tighten with love. They were happy. They were safe. That was what mattered. The doorbell rang, and Sarah opened it to find Betty standing on the porch, a casserole dish in her hands. "Thought I'd bring you dinner," Betty said, grinning. "And maybe stay for a visit if you've got time." Sarah laughed and ushered her in. They sat in the kitchen, bright and spacious, so different from the cramped apartment Sarah had left behind. Betty looked around, shaking her head in wonder. "Still can't believe this is real," she said. "You buying that hotel for $1, finding all that money? It's like something out of a movie." Sarah smiled. "Sometimes I can't believe it either." Betty leaned forward. "What are you going to do now? I mean, you don't have to work. You've got more money than most people see in 10 lifetimes. What comes next?" Sarah considered the question. She had thought about it often, lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling. What came next? "I'm going to help people," she said finally. "Women like I was. Women who are struggling, who don't have options, who need someone to believe in them. I'm starting a foundation. Scholarships, housing assistance, job training. I want to give them what I didn't have. A chance." Betty's eyes filled with tears. "That's beautiful, Sarah. That's really beautiful." They talked for hours, and when Betty left, Sarah stood on the porch, watching the sun sink below the horizon. The air was cool, carrying the scent of grass and flowers, and somewhere in the distance, she could hear the sound of children laughing. She thought of the woman she'd been 6 months ago, desperate and drowning, willing to bet everything on a collapsing hotel and a single dollar. That woman had been brave, though she hadn't known it at the time. She had been strong, though she'd felt weak, and she had been deserving, though she'd never believed it. Sarah whispered into the evening air, a promise to that woman, to herself. I made it. We made it. And I won't forget how hard it was. I won't forget what it cost. I'll use this to help others. I'll make it mean something. The stars began to emerge, pinpricks of light against the darkening sky, and Sarah stood there for a long time, feeling the weight of the past and the promise of the future, balanced perfectly in that quiet moment. She had bought a hotel for $1, when she had found a fortune, but more than that, she had found herself, and that, she realized, was the real treasure. The story of Sarah Chen spread beyond the local news, picked up by national outlets, turned into a symbol of hope and perseverance. People wrote to her, hundreds of letters from strangers sharing their own stories of struggle, thanking her for showing them that change was possible. Sarah read every letter, and each one reminded her why she was building the foundation, why she was using her wealth to lift others. One evening, several months later, Sarah received a call from a producer at a major television network. They wanted to do a feature story, a documentary about her journey from poverty to wealth. Sarah hesitated. The attention made her uncomfortable, the scrutiny exhausting. But Patricia encouraged her. "Well, your story matters," Patricia said. "It gives people hope. And the more attention the foundation gets, the more people you can help." Sarah agreed, and the cameras came. They filmed her at the hotel, now cordoned off and awaiting a decision about its future. They filmed her at the new house, with Emma and Lucas playing in the yard. They filmed her at the foundation's office, surrounded by staff she'd hired to manage the programs. The producer asked her the same question everyone asked. What was it like, buying that hotel for $1? What made you do it? Sarah thought carefully before answering. "I didn't have a choice," she said. "I was out of options. The eviction notice was real. The bills were real. The fear was real. I saw an opportunity, even though everyone thought I was crazy, and I took it. Because sometimes, desperation makes you brave." The producer nodded, scribbling notes. "And when you found the vault, when you realized what was inside, what did you feel?" Sarah smiled, remembering the moment, the flashlight's beam sweeping across metal boxes, the weight of possibility. "Relief," she said, "and terror, because I knew my life was about to change, and change is scary even when it's good." The documentary aired to strong ratings, and overnight, Sarah became more than just a local story. She was invited to speak at conferences, to share her experience at charity events, to be interviewed by magazines and podcasts. She said yes to some, no to others, learning to protect her boundaries, to keep some part of her life private. But she used the platform when she could, talking about poverty, about the struggles of single mothers, about the systems that kept people trapped. And slowly, the foundation grew. The $1 Foundation, she'd named it, a nod to the bet she'd taken. It provided grants to women in crisis, helping them with rent, childcare, education, job training. It partnered with organizations that supported families in need, that fought for economic justice, that believed no one should have to choose between feeding their children and paying their bills. Within a year, the foundation had helped over 500 women. Within 2 years, that number had doubled. Sarah hired staff, built infrastructure, created programs that could scale. The work was fulfilling in ways she hadn't anticipated, giving her a sense of purpose that money alone couldn't provide. 2 years after finding the vault, Sarah stood on a stage at a charity gala, looking out at a room full of donors and supporters. She wore a dress that fit her properly, her hair styled, her posture confident. But inside, she was still the woman who'd worked at Murphy's Diner, still the mother who'd lain awake at night, terrified of failing her children. She began to speak, her voice steady. 2 years ago, I bought a hotel for $1. Everyone thought I was crazy. My mother, my friends, even I thought I might be making the biggest mistake of my life. But I was desperate, and desperation has a way of making you see opportunities others dismiss. She paused, letting the silence settle. That hotel gave me more than money. It gave me a second chance. It gave my children security. But more than that, it taught me something important. She looked across the faces watching her, saw their attention, their curiosity. It taught me that sometimes the things everyone else considers worthless, the collapsed buildings, the impossible situations, the women society has written off, sometimes those things have more value than anyone realizes. We just have to be brave enough to look. The room erupted in applause, and Sarah felt her eyes sting with tears. She had come so far, from the cramped apartment with the eviction notice, from the diner shifts that ground her down, from the fear that had defined every day. She had climbed out of that pit, not just through luck, but through courage she hadn't known she possessed. After the gala, Sarah drove home through the quiet streets, the city lights fading behind her. She pulled into her driveway, sat for a moment in the car, and looked at her house. Warm light glowed from the windows. Inside, while Emma and Lucas were asleep, watched over by the nanny Sarah had hired. They were safe. They were loved. They had everything they needed. Sarah got out of the car and walked to the front door, pausing to look up at the stars. She thought of the vault, empty now, stripped of its treasures. She thought of the hotel, still standing despite its ruin, waiting for someone to decide its fate. And she thought of the woman she'd been, the one who'd walked into that courthouse and raised her hand to bid on something no one else wanted. "Thank you," she whispered to that woman, to herself. "Thank you for being brave." She opened the door and stepped inside, closing it softly behind her. The house was quiet, peaceful, filled with the kind of safety she'd once only dreamed about. And as Sarah climbed the stairs to check on her children, she realized that wealth wasn't just about money. It was about freedom, about choices, about the ability to shape your own life instead of being shaped by circumstances. She had found a fortune in a collapsing hotel, yes, but she had found something more valuable in herself. The strength to take a risk, the courage to believe she deserved better, the resilience to keep going even when everyone said she'd fail. Sarah stood in the doorway of her children's room, watching them sleep, and felt a peace so profound it made her chest ache. This was what the vault had really given her. Not just gold and jewels and bonds, but this moment, this life, this future. And she would spend every day of that future honoring the journey that had brought her here, helping others climb out of their own pits, proving that sometimes, betting everything on a single dollar was the wisest investment anyone could make. The collapsed hotel still stands at the edge of the valley, a monument to what once was and what might have been. Sarah owns it still, though she has no plans to rebuild it. Some things, she believes, should be left as reminders. Reminders that beauty can hide in ruins, that fortune can wait in darkness, and that sometimes the most valuable discoveries are the ones everyone else walked past without seeing. Sarah Chen's life transformed completely because she dared to see possibility where others saw only wreckage. Her children grew up knowing that their mother had given them not just security, but an example. That courage matters. That hope matters. That betting on yourself, even when the odds seem impossible, is never foolish. And every time someone asks her what it was like, finding $319 million in a hotel she bought for $1, Sarah smiles and tells them the truth. The money changed everything, she says. But the real treasure was learning that I was worth taking a chance on, that I deserved to hope, that my life had value, whether the vault was full or empty. The fortune was extraordinary, but discovering I had the strength to seek it, that was the miracle. And that's a treasure no one can ever take away. The hardest conversation Sarah had to have was with Emma and Lucas. She had waited weeks after Hendricks confirmed the valuation, uncertain how to explain to a 7-year-old and a 5-year-old that their lives were about to change in ways they couldn't comprehend. She chose a Saturday morning, when making their favorite pancakes, and sat them down at the kitchen table in the new house they'd just moved into. Emma noticed immediately. "Mama, why do you look scared?" she asked, her fork suspended halfway to her mouth. Sarah reached across the table and took both their hands. "I'm not scared, sweetheart. I just need to tell you something important." Lucas's eyes widened. "Are we in trouble?" "No, baby, we're not in trouble. We're the opposite of trouble." She took a breath. "Remember the hotel I bought? The one we visited together?" Emma nodded enthusiastically. "The scary one with all the broken windows." "Yes, that one." "Well, I found something inside it. Something very valuable." Sarah watched their faces, searching for understanding. "I found old treasures that people had hidden there a long time ago. And because I own the hotel, those treasures belong to us now." "What kind of treasures?" Lucas asked, his voice small. "Gold and jewels and things that are worth a lot of money," Sarah said. "So much money that we'll never have to worry about anything ever again." Emma's expression shifted, confusion giving way to something that looked like fear. "Does that mean we have to leave?" she asked quietly. "Leave our new house?" Sarah's heart clenched. "No, sweetheart. This is our house. We get to stay here. We get to stay anywhere we want." Emma relaxed slightly, but her next question cut deeper. "Does it mean you don't have to work at the diner anymore?" Sarah nodded. "I already quit the diner. But that's a good thing, because now I can spend more time with you. I can pick you up from school every day. We can have dinner together every night. I can be here." Tears welled in Emma's eyes, and she looked down at her plate. "I liked it when you worked at the diner. You always smelled like coffee, and Betty gave us cookies." Sarah moved around the table and pulled Emma into her arms. "We can still visit Betty, and I can still make coffee at home. Nothing has to change that we don't want to change." But Lucas, with the directness of a child, asked the question Sarah had been dreading. "Are we rich now?" Sarah hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, baby. We're rich." Lucas considered this, his face serious. "Does that mean we can get a dog?" Sarah laughed through the tears that had started falling. "Yes, we can definitely get a dog." And in that moment, with Emma clinging to her and Lucas asking about puppies, Sarah understood that for her children, the money meant something different than it meant to her. It meant stability, yes, security, and certainly. But more than that, it meant their mother wouldn't smell like exhaustion anymore. It meant she'd be there when they woke up and when they went to sleep. The fortune had bought them something more valuable than gold. It had bought them time with her. 3 weeks after the authentication was finalized, Sarah walked into a grocery store for the first time in her new life. She had been putting it off, clinging to old habits, buying only what was on sale, calculating every item's cost before placing it in the cart. But Patricia had insisted. "You need to practice spending money," Patricia had said. "Start small. Buy groceries without looking at prices. See how it feels." Sarah pushed her cart through the aisles, her hands sweating. She picked up strawberries, the expensive organic ones Emma loved, and put them in the cart without checking the price tag. The small act felt rebellious, dangerous. She added yogurt, the good kind with real fruit. Lucas's favorite cereal, the name brand, not the generic. Steaks for dinner, thick cuts that made her stomach clench until she reminded herself she could afford them. At the checkout, she loaded the conveyor belt and watched the total climb. $73, $92, $115. The numbers that once would have sent her into panic now barely registered. When the cashier said $147.32, Sarah handed over her credit card without flinching. The transaction completed, and she stood there for a moment, waiting for the familiar anxiety, the crushing weight of having spent too much. But it didn't come, and she picked up her bags and walked to her car, loaded the groceries, and sat in the driver's seat with her hands on the wheel. She had just spent nearly $150 on groceries without fear, without guilt, without the gnawing certainty that this would mean something else went unpaid. She started laughing, a sound that was half joy and half disbelief, and she couldn't stop. The woman parked next to her glanced over, concerned, but Sarah just waved and kept laughing until her sides hurt. 2 months after the story broke nationally, Sarah received a call from the courthouse. The clerk who'd run the auction, the one who'd sold her the hotel, wanted to meet. Sarah agreed, curious, and drove to the same building where her life had changed. The clerk was waiting in his office, a small man with thinning hair and tired eyes. "Ms. Chen," he said, standing to shake her hand. "Thank you for coming." Sarah sat across from him, her posture straight. "You wanted to see me." The clerk nodded, his expression uncomfortable. "I wanted to apologize." Sarah blinked. "For what?" The clerk folded his hands on his desk. "When you bid on that hotel, I thought you were making a mistake. A terrible mistake. I almost stopped the auction, almost refused to let you buy it. I thought I'd be doing you a favor." Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. "But you didn't." "No," the clerk said. "I didn't. And I'm grateful I didn't, because you proved me wrong. You proved everyone in that room wrong." He paused. "I've been doing these auctions for 20 years, Miss Chen. I've seen hundreds of properties sold, hundreds of people walk through that door, hoping to find a deal. And in all that time, I've never seen anyone find what you found. You took a risk everyone else dismissed. You saw something no one else could see, and you deserve everything that came from it." Sarah studied his face, saw the sincerity there, and felt her anger soften. "Thank you," she said quietly. The clerk leaned back in his chair. "There's something else. After your story went public, after people learned what you'd found, I had 3 different parties contact me, claiming they had a right to that property. Distant relatives of the original owners, investors who said they'd been interested in bidding. Even a historical society that claimed the items should be donated to a museum." Sarah's pulse quickened. And I told them all the same thing. The auction was legal. The sale was final. The property and everything in it belongs to you. There's no dispute, no claim that holds any legal weight. You're protected." Sarah let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I wanted you to know that you don't have to worry," the clerk said. "What you found is yours. No one can take it from you." Sarah stood, extended her hand. "Thank you. I mean it." The clerk shook her hand, his grip firm. "No, Ms. Chen, thank you. You reminded me that sometimes the most unlikely bets pay off, and that's a lesson I needed to learn." On the drive home, Sarah thought about the men in that auction room, the ones who'd laughed when she raised her hand. She wondered what they thought now. Whether they regretted not bidding, whether they told people they'd been there, witnessed history, but hadn't recognized it. The foundation's first client was a woman named Maria Rodriguez. She came to the office on a Thursday afternoon, her 2 children in tow, her eyes hollow with the kind of exhaustion Sarah recognized instantly. Maria worked 2 jobs, both at minimum wage, and was 3 months behind on rent. Her car had broken down, and without it, she couldn't get to work. She was drowning. Sarah sat across from her in the small office the foundation had rented and listened to Maria's story. "I've tried everything," Maria said, her voice breaking. "I've applied for assistance. I've talked to churches. I've asked family. No one can help. I don't know what to do. I don't know where to go." Sarah reached across the desk and took Maria's hand. "I know exactly how you feel," she said, "and I'm going to help you." The foundation paid Maria's back rent, paid to fix her car, gave her a grant to cover childcare so she could go back to school and finish her degree. 6 months later, Maria called Sarah, her voice bright with something Sarah hadn't heard in their first meeting. "Hope. I got a new job," Maria said. "A good job. I start next week. I'm going to be okay. And Sarah, I could never have done it without you. You saved my life." Sarah hung up the phone and sat in her office, tears streaming down her face. This, she thought, this was what the money was for. Not the house or the car or the security. This, giving someone else the chance she'd been given. The chance to breathe. Michael showed up at her new house on a Tuesday evening, unannounced. Sarah opened the door to find him standing on her porch, his hands in his pockets, his expression somewhere between sheepish and calculating. "Sarah," he said, "we need to talk." Sarah crossed her arms. "No, we don't. Michael, please, I made mistakes. I know I did. But we have children together. We should at least be civil." Sarah stepped onto the porch, closing the door behind her so Emma and Lucas wouldn't hear. "Civil is fine, Michael, but if you're here to ask for money, the answer is no." Michael's expression hardened. "I'm their father. I have a right to." "You have rights to visitation, which you barely use," Sarah said, her voice cold. "You have rights to be involved in their lives, which you've chosen not to be. But you don't have rights to my money." Michael's jaw clenched. "I supported you for years. I helped you." "Helped me," Sarah repeated, her voice rising. "You left, Michael. You walked out, stopped paying child support, and disappeared. I did this alone. I found that hotel. I took that risk. And I'm not sharing it with someone who gave up on us." Michael stared at her, and she saw the moment he realized she meant it. The moment he understood that the woman he'd left behind, the one he'd thought would always need him, was gone. He turned and walked to his car without another word. Sarah watched him drive away, and when his taillights disappeared around the corner, she felt a weight lift that she hadn't known was there. She had faced him, stood her ground, and won. Not because of the money, but because she finally believed she deserved to. The therapy sessions were harder than Sarah expected. Her therapist, Dr. Evelyn Morris, was a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and a directness that cut through Sarah's defenses. "You're carrying guilt," Dr. Morris said during their third session. "Guilt about what?" "About the money. About having it when others don't." Sarah shifted in her chair. "Is that wrong?" Dr. Morris leaned forward. "It's human. But Sarah, you didn't steal this money. You didn't take it from anyone. You found it. You took a risk no one else would take, and it paid off. That doesn't make you a bad person." "But I had luck," Sarah said. "Other people worked just as hard as I did. Harder. And they're still struggling." Dr. Morris nodded. "You're right. And that's why you started the foundation. You're using your fortune to help them. But you also need to let yourself enjoy it. You need to accept that you deserve good things." Sarah looked down at her hands. "I don't know how." "Then that's what we're going to work on," Dr. Morris said gently. "One day at a time. Teaching you that your worth isn't measured by your suffering, that you're allowed to be happy." The documentary crew filmed Sarah for a week, following her through her daily routines. They captured her dropping Emma and Lucas at their new school, a private academy with small classes and attentive teachers. They filmed her at the foundation office, meeting with clients, reviewing applications. They filmed her returning to Murphy's Diner, sitting in a booth with Betty, the two women laughing over coffee. And they filmed her at the hotel, standing in the empty vault, her voice quiet as she spoke to the camera. "This place changed my life," Sarah said, "but I think it was always going to change. I think I was always going to find a way forward, with or without the money, because I had to. For my children, for myself. The vault just made it easier. But the courage, the determination, that was already there. I just didn't know it yet." When the documentary aired, Sarah watched it with Emma and Lucas curled up beside her on the couch. She saw herself on screen, heard her own voice, and felt strange, as though she were watching someone else's life. "Is that really you, Mama?" Lucas asked. Sarah hugged him close. "Yes, baby, that's really me." Emma looked up at her, her expression serious. "You're brave, Mama." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "So are you, sweetheart. Both of you. We were brave together." The moment Sarah knew she had truly changed came on an ordinary Wednesday afternoon. She was walking through the mall with Patricia, discussing investment strategies, when she passed a jewelry store. In the window was a necklace, simple but elegant, and Sarah stopped to look at it. "It's beautiful," Patricia said. Sarah nodded, studying it. Then, without overthinking, she walked into the store and bought it. The transaction took minutes. The necklace cost $8,000, and Sarah didn't hesitate, didn't calculate, didn't feel the old panic rise. She wore it out of the store, the weight of it against her collarbone, unfamiliar but pleasant. And as she caught her reflection in a window, she realized something profound. She looked happy. Not just content, not just relieved, but genuinely happy. The woman staring back at her was someone she barely recognized. Someone who stood straight, who smiled easily, who wore $8,000 necklaces without guilt. Someone who had fought her way out of darkness and learned to live in the light. And for the first time since finding the vault, Sarah didn't feel like an imposter. She felt like herself, the woman she was always meant to be. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.